silver nå? Nei. Jo. Maleus maleficaro.
Varg Vikernes, født 11.2.73, dømmes til en straff av fengsel i 21 år.
Heavy metal has often been on the more extreme side of what art has to offer. As a genre connecting with disenfranchised kids all across the world, it provides an outlet for aggressive tendencies and even depression. And how heavy metal has evolved has relied heavily on where and when the music is discovered, and how the youth of that area would go on to contribute to it in their own unique ways. For the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1980s, a combination of bands like Motorhead, The Misfits, and Diamond Head would see the creation and explosion of thrash metal and the rise of a titanic force in the genre's evolution. But some of these bands would take that image to an elevated level, invoking satanic occult themes and fast aggressive instrumentals, and that's precisely how those dark feelings are expressed and spread to the world around us. With a trend of sensational satanic media painting the backdrop of the 80s and 90s, these bands would poke the bear the best they could, looking to get a rise out of their uptight parents. But as the music evolves and the themes get darker, what kind of evil could it manifest into reality, and how would a sensational media treat that evil when informing the public about it? Today, we're going to look at how the satanic panic of the 1980s spread like a virus into Norway, mostly thanks to the efforts of a small contingent of black metal headbangers. A group of kids so extreme that it may be difficult to defend their actions, even as an understanding representative of heavy metal to a normie audience. It's a story that stains heavy metal as a whole, but is also integral to its evolution. And the impact that this small community of Norwegian youth would leave behind is a lot bigger than you would expect from such an isolated set of human beings. A young man obsessed with death takes the ultimate steps to find out its darkest secrets. And rivalry between a particularly eccentric set of young men ends in smoldering ashes, blood-spattered walls, and a profound legacy of violence. This is the satanic sensationalism of black metal and the murder of Euronymous.
You have to give a blood sacrifice to Satan. It's supposed to keep you protected. It's supposed to keep you pure.
They said that if we told that the devil would come and kill our parents.
It doesn't matter if you believe in Satan. It doesn't matter if you believe in demons. What's important is to know that there are people out there that do, and that are willing to do anything to accomplish their goal.
Satanic panic is something I've gone on about a lot, in both the period of American history that it refers to, as well as the more general idea that permeates societies all over the world to this day. It is typically a moral panic that has very little in the way of real, tangible evidence. I've white-knighted heavy metal and shock rock satanic themes in the name of personal responsibility and media sensationalism. The underground satanic cults wreaking havoc on the youth throughout the 1980s had effectively no evidence and led to years-long trials that wasted taxpayer dollars, or even worse, cost a couple 22 years of their life. Ricky Casso, the Acid King, and his crimes were overshadowed by a throwaway comment during his interrogation, leading to the attention being put on satanic rituals and heavy metal instead of honoring the life that he took. To a similar end, I have also touched many times on the Moral Panic's continued influence throughout the 1990s. Krista Pike, Elise Poller, and the West Memphis 3 all saw that satanic panic firmly applied to it with varying degrees of justification for it. While I try to stress that my commentary is in no way meant to devalue your opinion on these cases, my own thoughts and feelings are all that I'm really qualified to give you with any authority. Very real and very dark events take place in each of those stories, but where we may diverge with one another is who's to blame for those actions. The events in totality play out like math, at least to me. Sensational headlines and rebellious youth come together to stir the public that would look down their noses at anyone with long hair and a black t-shirt. Stigma would follow metal's golden decade, with conservative, older generations attributing their panic to what they perceived as a very real invasion of the Morningstar. And it's unlikely to be the last time that I touch on it. But I've also made it clear that real evils exist in the world, and it would be very easy to find people doing terrible things in the name of everyone's second favorite villain. The Joker is number one, for sure. My critique, as someone who didn't live through it, was about a hungry media and greasy prosecutors injecting the devil to sell their wares. The fear of large, organized societies of satanic freaks is very alive and well to this day, making it all seem quite relevant to me to explore with you. Heavy metal's role in the moral panic was that of theatrics and shock. From the very beginning of the 1980s, bands donned themselves in pentagrams, created offensive cover art, and put on a show for a youth aching to make their parents squirm and gasp. As genres like death metal festered in the late 80s, intense lyrical content would go far to earn their parental advisory label. But like any movement that finds its footing in the entertainment world, it would be hijacked by an industry that has been corporatizing once anti-corporate mediums for decades. Heavy metal was absolutely no exception. So let's take a look at a set of bands that would go on to inspire a generation of angsty headbangers with vile imagery and lyrical content in true shock rock fashion, even if it rang a little too true to a certain set of Nordic youths later on.
We just had to go out there and do our own thing, and nobody else was doing what we were doing. And everybody else had their own sound, their own way of doing things, whatever. Now we came out and like, now, how many bands have we got doing the black metal scene? Thrash metal, death metal, speed metal, black metal. There's hundreds of bands doing it.
Black metal, like nearly every other subgenre of heavy metal that would take place in the 1980s, is built on the foundation of the new wave of British heavy metal. As heavy metal progressed through its first decade, the 1970s, founding father bands like Black Sabbath, Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, and Motorhead would spawn an array of amazing bands from across the pond that would find their way over to the United States. Of this class of bands, the most important and the band that is often credited with naming the black metal genre itself, Venom would find a massive underground fan base in the Bay Area of California especially. Venom's freshman album Welcome to Hell would introduce a fast, aggressive style, but would also play heavily on satanic imagery and lyrical content. Their follow-up record, Black Metal, would continue this aesthetic, heavily influencing Bay Area thrash metal bands like Slayer, and is touted as the reason for the corresponding subgenre's title. Along with both their predecessors and peers, they would be the biggest ingredient to how black metal took shape. They are an underrated pillar of many history-making movements in heavy metal, a fate that many new wave of British heavy metal bands face, unfortunately. But Venom would not be the only band to hold up Lucifer and occult imagery to shock and awe, with Danish heavy metal legends Merciful Fate coming up in the early 1980s. While black metal's sound would diverge pretty heavily from Merciful Fate's signature style and King Diamond's epic vocals, their theatrics and occult themes would be taken heavily by later black metal movements. I'm mentioning and noting the importance of these bands to thrash and death metal because it will tie into the motivations of Norwegian black metal's obsession with being more than just a show. Right about here is where my personal tastes diverge, leaving me vulnerable to missing a connection or influential band. The history of how this small, isolated part of the world influenced the entirety of heavy metal is fascinating and very interesting to me. It can be a touchy community to this day like any other subset of metalhead, and while I've made sure to do my best to respect the history, it's a mentality that I don't share. I just want to be upfront about that as we continue to map the road to mayhem, so if you notice anything missing, please feel free to rip my head off. Sweden would be home to multiple heavy influences for black metal as a genre, with bands like Bathory and Celtic Frost. Bathory especially would be key to the sound of black metal as it made its way to Norway in the early 90s, and Celtic Frost, a band that evolved from Hellhammer, incorporated elements of thrash, doom, and gothic rock, and was essential in expanding the boundaries of black metal. All of these influences, while being the foundation of the Norwegian black metal evolution, would come together with other genres and major names like Metallica, Slayer, Death, Possessed, and so many others that mapping it all out with my Floridian brain will definitely result in a headache somewhere in this process. The thrash and death metal scenes in the United States would progress alongside the Norwegian black metal movement. However, it would fork off pretty heavily early in the decade. I only mention this because later motivations of the isolated black circle in Norway in part were a direct objection to the way these genres evolved. These bands would line the walls and don the chests of a specific set of Norwegian misfits, as well as a troubled young man in Sweden, kicking off a history that not only shaped heavy metal itself, but may be overshadowed by the immeasurable misery that they would take part in throughout the 1990s. The stigma against headbangers across the world waving the flags of shock rock Satanism is quite understandable, but for the Norwegian black metal scene, it would take an interesting turn internally. Also, before we get too serious, I'm going to butcher these names. I've looked them up, I've listened to people say them out loud, and I'm going to say them incorrectly, because these blonde, snow-dwelling black metal kids have muscles in their mouths that I just don't have as a product of the Florida school system. Again, feel free to rip my head off for it. The early black metal movement in Oslo was defined by heavy, fast guitars and shocking lyrical content, as well as a raw DIY style that drew in a special type of metalhead. Early Norwegian black metal bands were working with what they had. Being so isolated in the world, it drew a special kind of person, and as the movement began to stir, we would see the beginnings of what would go on to be an especially notable evolution of heavy metal. To map it all out completely is a tough task, and there's certainly more to go from here. So much goes into these subgenre evolutions that it's sure to be debated to the end of time. But these elements set the stage for a movement that would go on to see a violent reputation, mostly due to a special set of rivals, a brutal murderer, and a media circus.
Svin.
(1984) would see the formation of Mayhem, a black metal outfit out of Oslo, Norway, following in the footsteps of bands like Venom, Bathory, and Celtic Frost. The band would be helmed by guitarist Øystein Aarseth. Better known by the moniker he would be immortalized as Euronymous. Disenchanted with the direction that the more extreme American metal scenes were headed in, Mayhem and others in the Norwegian black metal scene would seek to outdo their black and death metal predecessors. As the local youth were coming of age, they would be influenced in a very similar way to analogous movements across the world. But their isolation and lack of access to studios and expensive equipment, their particular take on black metal would see this lo-fi sound as an integral part of it. This and the satanic, occult, and death-obsessed themes would see the beginnings of the Norwegian black metal scene. Mayhem would take a few years to get any releases, but in 1987 they would release their debut EP, Death Crush, a release that would go on to be hailed as one of the subgenre's greatest. Euronymous would put on a persona of a dark, death-obsessed youth making big claims about how real he was, compared to the more commercial metal genres and the artists that led them. Immediately after the release of Death Crush, the band would be looking for a replacement vocalist, and once the news made its way to a young man in Sweden, the history would begin to expand. Per Yngve Olin, who would later take on the moniker Dead, was born in Stockholm, Sweden. While coming up in a relatively normal home, a childhood encounter with a group of bullies would lead to a severe beating and a ruptured spleen, nearly cutting his life short. After he recovered from his injuries, he became obsessed with death, enamored with the darker truths of the hidden world even at a young age. As he grew into his teens, he would take on a love for the same heavy metal bands that influenced many teens across the world, prompting him to form his own band. Even early on, his fascination with death and dark themes permeated his lyrical content and style. But with his current prospects going nowhere in his eyes, his venture into the cementing Norwegian black metal scene would prove to be an opportunity for the troubled young man, and the theatrics that Dead is remembered for would certainly be cemented with his discovery of Mayhem. Once Dead learned of Mayhem's need for a vocalist, he would take the initiative to reach out to Euronymous, and through letters would display to him his dark, fascinating ideas. With the mask that Euronymous was building with his band, he began to feel that Dead would be a perfect fit for them. According to bassist this guy, Necrobutcher. These names are killing me. According to Necrobutcher, Dead initially made contact with the band by sending them a parcel containing letters detailing his ideas, a demo tape to show off his talents, and a crucified mouse. Once accepted into the established crew, Dead would bring a theatrical energy that would go on to define his legacy. It was here that he took on his moniker and would bring it to life by burying his stage clothing in the yard and digging them back up to wear for performances. He would also open himself up on stage in front of a rabid crowd with ceremonial knives and glass. The black metal signature corpse paint would play a massive part in the image, and while Mayhem drummer Hellhammer would claim that Dead was the first to bring it to the stage, Euronymous has been spotted in live performances sporting it well before his introduction. Either way, Mayhem was integral to spreading its popularity in the scene. He would bring butchered animals on stage and puff the stench of death from dead birds found at venues, and would strive to live up to the image he was putting forth, much like Euronymous did in his music. They were quite similar souls, ultimately leading to a bit of a rivalry between the two. But Dead was an extremely troubled kid. It's been speculated that his childhood near-death experience left him afflicted with deep psychological issues and potentially walking corpse syndrome. Those psychological issues, while contributing heavily to his music and legacy, would also take their toll on the young man. He would have bouts of deep depression, and with Euronymous believing his obvious psychological torment was good for the image of the band, he would be encouraged by his bandmate to sink deeper into these issues. All of this would lead to one of the most shocking displays that heavy metal has ever had. The band would convene at a house in the woods just outside of Oslo. It would be here that they would write and arrange their music. And while Dead would appear on a handful of live recordings and bootlegs, work on their next record would be interrupted by a severe bout of depression. This stage in Dead's life would see him holed up in solitude, brewing in a deep depression that would be expressed with writings and drawings. The music would take a back seat to this darkness. In April of 1991, Euronymous would return from a trip out of town to the Mayhem house. All of the doors were locked and the only key was inside, forcing him to scale up to the second floor to an unlocked window leading to Dead's room. Upon crawling through the window, he would discover the body of Per Yngve, deceased from a self-inflicted shotgun wound to the head. It was a horror scene that would likely traumatize anyone else, but Euronymous, true to his form, would forego calling authorities and instead choose to acquire his camera to get pictures of the carnage. Once he got a good collection of images, legend has it that he took pieces of Dead's skull, fashioning necklaces out of them to send to his friends. Pieces of his skull have even been posted and sold to hardcore collectors in the continuing scene. His demeanor and capitalization of the tragic situation were something that didn't sit well with Necrobutcher, who in later interviews would describe Dead as one of his best friends. He went on to say that Euronymous seemed almost joyous about the situation and that he wanted to kill him over it. He wouldn't get the chance, however. A little foreshadowing. Euronymous would spread rumors of Dead's motivation being due to the number of posers now filling the ranks of Norwegian black metal. It's morbid and worthy of criticism, but it's always been a gatekeeper mentality that is present in every single subgenre of metal's evolution. Dead's short time with Mayhem would burn a nuclear shadow into the fabric of metal history, for nothing else but its theatrical introductions to the scene and the insane way that the story ends. Euronymous would continue on with the rest of the band, using one of the pictures he took of the scene as the cover for a live bootleg release, Dawn of the Black Hearts. It stands out as one of the most unethical products heavy metal has ever produced. It would stoke rumors of vile deeds done with Dead's remains, and Euronymous would capitalize on the situation greatly by stoking these rumors and using it as an example of how real Mayhem was. While controversial to many, it did draw in a dedicated following that gathered under Euronymous, hailing him as the leader of their movement.
It sure changed a lot. They started to pretend that there was some satanic movement and conspiracy in the society, that the people who burned the churches were really Satanists who planned to spread evil, all this crap. And when I got out of prison, there was nothing I could do about it. I told them this has nothing to do with Satanism, and they never paid any attention to what I said.
Parallel to Dead's final weeks, Euronymous, who had his own record label leading the charge of the Norwegian black metal scene, would meet one Varg Vikernes. Varg was the sole member of the black metal band Burzum, and with his impressive demo tapes would catch the attention of the movement's leader. He would be signed and have his first release with them around the same time that the scene was learning of Dead's fate. Varg is a character. He is touted as a talented artist, but his political leanings, belief in Odinism, and staunch anti-Judeo-Christian ideals would be combined with his image among his black metal peers. Beyond his stunt with Dead's discovery, Euronymous seems to have been mostly talk. He would openly encourage and lay claim to vile and evil acts, but from everything that I've seen, it was mostly just brain rot edgelord stuff. The scene and its evolution are convoluted, and its grassroots foundation leaves a lot of room for rumors and exaggerated stories by people looking to live up to the hype, so very little is really all that confirmed. He was a leader of the movement, and with the opening of his record store would see the local scene orbit around him and his shop. He would form a closer group of individuals referred to as the Black Circle. The front-facing image portrayed by the small community's leaders was something that Varg took very seriously. He wanted to be more than just hype and prove to the movement that he was willing to take action. To this end, he would begin a destructive campaign of church burnings across Norway, turning centuries of cultural significance and what he saw to be Christian intrusion into his pagan holy sites to nothing but smoldering ash and societal fear. Varg and a small group would claim dozens of these churches, sparking fears that were being broadcast through newspaper and television reports. Those closest to the black metal movement knew of his proven worth, but it didn't seem to be enough for him. He was fiercely anti-Judeo-Christian and would eventually turn to National Socialist politics. Likely to this end, he wanted the whole of Norway to know who was behind the church burnings, as authorities had absolutely no leads to follow, leaving them completely free to continue the terror. Varg would reach out to media outlets and, under the threat of death, would give his motives and claim his glory for the burnings in a small meeting, crediting himself under his pseudonym Count Grishnackh. According to Varg, Euronymous was part of this planned interview with the group, hoping it would be good for the movement's image. With strict instructions, he would give details that were not released to the public, and as journalists confirmed he was the real deal, they agreed to his demands and they held the interview. But instead of printing what Varg had told them to, they went to the authorities, leading to him being arrested and the media going with a narrative of satanic sensationalism instead. They would paint not only Varg, but the entire black metal movement as a cult of satanic heathens out to destroy the houses of God and perform occult rituals in the flickering light of the flames. While I'm sure he wasn't pleased to be detained by authorities for a matter of weeks, Varg was basking in the media attention and thought it would be great for the evil obsession that black metal was meant to represent. He was released when law enforcement was unable to collect enough evidence against him and his accomplices. But Euronymous refused to play into the hype and shut down the record store. He stowed away inside, looking to let the attention pass. This would anger Varg, as he believed that this was exactly the publicity that Euronymous wanted, and their already strained connection would begin to reach a boiling point. It appears to me that Euronymous didn't want the smoke, and the involvement of the authorities in this dark little corner of Norway was more than he was willing to deal with. The indirect claims made by Varg taking credit for the burning of the churches would spark a satanic panic around Norway and would spread Norwegian black metal to the world with the release of Kerrang! Issue number 436, on March 27, 1993. Kerrang was essential for the spread of subgenres being cultivated across the world and had a heavy hand in spreading the new wave of British heavy metal to the Bay Area thrash lords in the early 1980s. As a respected publication among headbangers everywhere, the extreme nature of black metal and the actions to back it up would be a viral wave among them, and it would be an essential tool for the cementing of this small movement's massive impact and legacy within the heavy metal history books. With the history surrounding all of this, everything seems like hyperbolic word-of-mouth telling of the events that unfolded. But one thing is certain: Varg did not take Euronymous' betrayal lightly, and their relationship, already tenuous, was at the horizon of a violent breaking point.
The year is 1993, and all of a sudden, one day, black metal becomes world famous. What happened? Let's find out.
This part of the story is going to rely heavily on Varg's recollection of events. Varg, at least to my surface level understanding of him, is a freak, so take it how you will. Whether or not he is a reliable narrator is likely going to be up to your subjective opinion. But what is not disputed is that heavy metal history would be violently branded with a stain that we've yet to wash off to this day. The satanic panic surrounding Norwegian black metal was both earned and exaggerated. While Varg's antics were indeed hardcore and extreme, painting black metal in exactly the light he wanted it to be, his motivations had nothing to do with Satan. He wasn't a Satanist and wasn't performing rituals. But that didn't stop the media from claiming as much. Either way, black metal was spreading with an especially brutal reputation, and it could only be good news to the small, death-obsessed cult that gathered in the basement of Helvete. But Euronymous wasn't having any of it. Making claims of brutal activities was not a new thing for Euronymous. It was normal for him to boast and brag among anyone who wandered into his hole-in-the-wall record store, but he began to openly express his disdain for Varg. He began to tell others in a close group about a plan to kill Varg, and since it wasn't something he was openly boasting about behind the register to everyone, once Varg heard about this plot, he decided to be proactive. He took the threat seriously, and on the night of August 10th, 1993, he embarked on a trip to Euronymous' apartment to confront him. Again, according to Varg, when he arrived and knocked on the door, Euronymous answered and was immediately uneasy. As Varg entered the apartment, Euronymous would launch an attack, kicking Varg in the chest. Varg, armed with a pocket knife, would defend himself by stabbing Euronymous twice in the head, 5 times in the neck, and 27 times in the back. It was a violent affair, and the brutality indicated rage and resentment. Varg has made claims that Euronymous was attempting to make it to various parts of the apartment to acquire a weapon, but no evidence of this was ever found. As far as police would find later on, it appeared that Øystein Aarseth, known to the masses as Euronymous, leader of the Norwegian black metal movement, was brutally attacked and no motive was ever determined. He was a troubled and disturbed young man, facing a harrowing end at the age of 25. His legacy would be cemented, set upon the foundation of his small space and big impact in Norway, by the brutal end at the hand of one of his own black metal elite. As the murder reached headlines, it would make a massive wave among heavy metal as a whole, burning the massive impact of Norwegian black metal into the fabric of heavy metal itself. It was no secret who was responsible for the murder of Euronymous. Already being a high-profile villain in the area, and following a police investigation linking him to the murder, Varg would be arrested and charged with the crime. It would be made all the more concrete with the arrest of Blackthorn, who accompanied Varg on the night of the murder, serving mostly as a lookout. He would give his testimony about his involvement in the crime. A combination of witness testimony, forensic evidence, and a gas station receipt placing him in the area at the relevant time made for a solid foundation to arrest him on. It was an open and shut case that took the already sensational electricity surrounding the Norwegian black metal scene and made it world news. It would become one of heavy metal's most violent events, and to this day is likely the first thing that would come to mind when looking for violent crimes connected to the genre. It would see Varg as one of heavy metal's most infamous figures, and to this day, any mention or comments of support will likely have you set ablaze on social media. Separating the art from the artist, Burzum is wildly influential to the genre and its evolution, but for many, it's overshadowed by his mad ramblings and violent actions. At the other end, it would rob Euronymous of the ability to see exactly how titanic he would be within heavy metal's progression going forward. Mayhem is a pillar of later black metal movements, and its most influential figure is certainly Euronymous. Along with Dead, Euronymous is hailed as a legend, shaping the nature of the shocking thematic quality of lyrical content and aggressive raw energy of the genre's sound. Varg Vikernes would plead not guilty at his trial, asserting that Euronymous intended to kidnap him, bring him to Oslo, and torture him to death for a snuff film he would then distribute for the clout that would follow such a dark action. He claimed that he was simply defending himself from an attack, knowing that Euronymous had intentions to kill him. But the evidence presented painted a very different picture, and Varg would be found guilty. He was sentenced to the maximum allowed, 21 years. He's noted in interviews that compared to American standards, it's pretty light. Varg would serve that sentence writing and recording music, authoring many books, and sitting down for an array of interviews. He would pursue his ideologies and learn new languages. He even found love and was married while incarcerated, and with the allowance of conjugal visits would even father a child. He remained an active and controversial figure in the scene, espousing whatever it was he was espousing. He would lash out in interviews over the media narrative surrounding his crimes and the satanic painting they would apply to him. Making multiple appeals for parole, he would be denied a few times but would be released in 2009, serving only 15 years of his 21-year sentence. After all of these events would take place, Mayhem would continue on much as it had after the loss of Dead. They would release their first studio album in 1994 and would blaze a separate history, forever chained to Euronymous in their early days. Varg, after being released from prison in 2009, would focus his pursuits on his ideological beliefs. He would take to social media to espouse his message, and much like he had while incarcerated, he would continue to write and create books and music. He would even create his own Dungeons & Dragons style RPG called My Frog. My Frog? It's in all caps. My Frog? I don't play stuff like that. He's focused mainly on raising his family and doomsday prepping or something. These are the wild and infamous events that have either stained or bolstered Norwegian black metal as a genre, depending on who you ask. As a representation of heavy metal overall, held up against fan bases of bands like Judas Priest, Metallica, or Sepultura, they are one of the most extreme examples of the music being connected to satanic occult themes and real-life violence. And while I suppose I can understand how the troubled young men would be attracted to the theatrics of it all, as well as the clout and power that came with leading such a charge in a small, isolated part of the world, all it took was one freak to cement the movement's infamy among a greater public.
When I heard it, almost a cold shiver goes down your spine, and you think, what is all this about? And what disturbs me is how is it possible that 4 boys from a decent, ordinary society with a Christian background, parents of 2 of the boys committed Christians, and I say, what on earth went wrong? Now, if it can happen to these sort of chaps, well, goodness knows, what's going to happen to even more vulnerable people?
Norwegian black metal is not my thing. It's above and beyond a sound that doesn't really appeal to my dad metal tastes. But the history is both wildly fascinating and very complex, to a point that I likely have nothing close to a grasp on it. While I do know that its impact on the overall genre of heavy metal is vast and revered, its word of mouth and rumor-filled retellings leave me about as confused as I was taking any advanced math class in high school. Those who are in the know are quite fervent and prefer that idiots like me stay away from it. So I'm expecting at least some passionate responses to this video if anyone actually sees it. I've defended many times the right of an artist to express their art in any way they wish. Heavy metal specifically is an art form that I love and understand and has been stigmatized to the general public for years now. A stigma that never really went away, at least not entirely. And in some ways, that's exactly the point. Violent art creating violent people is a debate that still rages to this day, from video games to horror movies to heavy metal. It's often connected to terrible events in an effort to explain the actions of a depraved individual and their evil deeds. Chris Watts listening to Metallica while disposing of the bodies of his wife and 2 little girls. The trio of troubled teens looking to sacrifice a young Elise Pauler in the name of Slayer. Ricky Casso and his open love for the music being tied to his horrific crime. In each of those cases, I would argue to the death that the violent media doesn't create violent people, but instead, violent people are drawn to violent media. And the events in this story are one of the toughest to defend in this way, and it's not hard for me to see why. Heavy metal in the 1980s, amid the satanic panic, fed off of the uneasy feeling that uptight parents got. An environment of competition would see bands get heavier and heavier in their sound, lyrical content, and onstage theatrics. And in lockstep with it, a continued satanic panic would follow. As those intense themes festered and developed, the music would make its way to a small section of Norway, filled with angsty youth who would take it from the stage and preach it in real life until finally, someone decided to put their money where their mouth is. So, in a way, the satanic panic of the American 1980s can be connected like a viral chain to the satanic sensationalism in Norway in the aftermath of Euronymous and Mayhem's hellish early years. Is heavy metal responsible for the events that took place? The church burnings robbed a country of centuries of human history. A troubled young Swedish kid who decided to find out what was on the other side. And a brutal murder motivated by the need for power and to prove that this was more than a show. And to lighten it up a little bit here, some of you may be wondering, what does Uncle Hawk think of Norwegian black metal now that he's dug into it a few inches? I think its early iterations sound terrible, even though I know it's on purpose. And I think it's a bunch of disenfranchised, brain-f***ed edgelords trying to find some way to make a mark on an art form that they love. I understand not only how important the genre is to heavy metal as a whole, but this particular situation, in hindsight, was massively important to the spread of it. For better or worse, it's up to you. It was a movement that managed to make that mark, and then along comes Count Grizzledick, or whatever his name was, to dampen the party for the rest of us. I'm sure there's stuff out there that I would like, but I just haven't found it yet. Maybe leave me a few suggestions. Ladies and gentlemen, if you've made it this far, thank you once again for letting me tell you another story and make another video about the devil, murder, and heavy metal, all in one. It really is the perfect fit subject-wise for how I've populated the channel so far, and I find it all super interesting, and I'm honestly not even sure if I've even begun to learn anything about black metal at all, so if you have anything you want to educate me with, let me know in the comments. Like the video if you like the video, dislike the video, and let me know how much you can't stand my voice. Try and keep it civil in the comments if you're gonna fight over Burzum, and if you're feeling really generous, tell your friends about the channel. If you want to support further, you can become a member or hit up the Patreon. I'm going to start posting some behind the scenes of the process and maybe even some commentary watch parties of my older videos to talk about what I was thinking and how I put it together. I'm not really good enough at this to get a sponsor for the video, so your support means the world to me in this wobbly time in my life. Doc and Sarge say thank you for the puppy treats. Even just giving me the time by watching the videos blows my mind that anyone cares enough, so thank you so much. If you like this video, you may like my video on Satanic Panic. Remember to love your pets, and I'll catch you in the next garbage fire. Big Patreon and member shout out to Daniel, Gage, Jeremy, Leslie, Lisa, McLean, Richard, Ryan, Weapon Son Gaming, Craig, Dr. Spiderface, Christian. Big shout out for Melissa, who is both a member and a patron, Ghost Dragon, who did all the music for this video, and of course my mommy. This part of the story is going to rely heavily on Varg Vikernes' Vikernes. I'm trying. Vikernes. I'm trying so hard to say it the right way, okay? Fuck me.